While the Atari VCS was without question the most popular game console of its day, this was never a guaranteed outcome. Before Space Invaders helped Atari's system explode into a runaway success in 1980, Fairchild's Channel F was the first credible challenger the VCS faced. Atari's system may have ended up as the programmable market leader in those first few years anyway, but understanding the challenges that Fairchild faced can help describe why that was the case. And so, we have today the story of the Fairchild Channel F. The Channel F, in broad strokes, was the first programmable video game home system to reach the home market. Powered by Fairchild's F8 microprocessor, a fairly small number of Channel F systems reached store shelves starting in the tail end of November 1976, before shipments picked up the following year. The popular history is that the Channel F was a market failure with crummy games that would eventually be sold to Zircon for liquidation. But of course, this is a distortion of actual events. But before we get into why the Channel F ended up not being the world beater despite being first, we have to get into the Channel F's development history. Fortunately, historian Benj Edwards delved deep into the earliest days of the Channel F's creation in a long-form article published in 2015. He revealed that the system has its origins in the Connecticut-based Elpex Computer Corporation. Elpex was in a rough position after a computerized cash register system fell through. And with President Norman Elpert looking to take risks, around 1974 the company decided to try its hand at the emerging video game market, which at the time was entirely built around transistor logic, or TTL games. Magnavox essentially had a monopoly on the home market with its Odyssey game system, while in arcades clones of Pong were the hot ticket item as Atari struggled to keep up with demand. Elpex engineer Wallace Kirshner saw an opportunity to marry the then recent development of microprocessors, notably the Intel 8008, with a game system, and got the green light early that year to see what he could come up with. Elpex hired Lawrence Haskell, a software engineer, to assist in the project, with Kirshner designing the hardware and Haskell taking the lead on software development. They dubbed the machine Raven, an acronym for Remote Access Video Entertainment. Using an Intel 8008, later upgraded to an Intel 8080, and an expensive 8 kilobits of memory, Raven could produce a black and white display at the resolution of 128 by 64 pixels. Haskell was familiar with Pong from the arcades and the Odyssey's own take on table tennis, and opted to create a variant of that known as hockey based on his own experiences playing that game during New England winters. Players could move their player paddles independently around the playfield, rotate them to help angle shots, and even move goalies up and down to protect the nets. Haskell's game was remarkably advanced for the time, even if the controls left something to be desired. The button panels used on Raven were described later by Fairchild engineer Jerry Lawson during a court deposition as being comfortable if you had 3 hands to work with. Haskell would go on to create a doodle program, a shooting gallery, and tic-tac-toe for Raven, all of which would re-emerge on the commercial Channel F. With this array of software, Kirshner and Haskell began considering how programs would be swapped. The console itself was expensive, after all, so it would make sense to only have a consumer buy it once and then change games out. While this idea came up in a fashion with the Odyssey, which was also a base unit that used cards to change games, in practice these cards were simply completing circuits on the actual system. For the Odyssey, this was a job that could have been done, and indeed was done on the prototype brown box, with buttons. Kirshner and Haskell's solution skipped over the idea of cassette tapes or some other form of magnetic media, in favor of mounting the EEPROM chips containing the game data onto a circuit board, and then simply building a port to plug that into on Raven, allowing one to switch games. Now at a good point, Elpex began shopping around Raven to other larger businesses with more money to get their project to market. After being rejected by a variety of TV manufacturers, Elpex found success with Fairchild, a semiconductor company. News of Elpex's project made its way to Wilf Corrigan, Fairchild's CEO, sending engineers Gene Landrum and Jerry Lawson to evaluate the Raven. Lawson was a video game aficionado who had even built his own Demolition Derby game in his garage based on Fairchild's F8 microprocessor, making him a sensible choice alongside Landrum, who had come over from National Semiconductor where he was head of the consumer products division. The two men felt Raven had potential. Landrum wrote a report in November 1975 recommending Fairchild move into the video game space with Raven, with some rosy expectations in terms of sales volumes and global market potential. and Fairchild announced a 4-year exclusivity deal with Alpex to turn this into a commercial product in February 1976. This was the second such game-related announcement from Fairchild in as many months. In January, Fairchild also announced an agreement with coin-op company Mirco to produce dedicated home consoles based on their ball and paddle arcade titles, though this later broke down and resulted in lawsuits between Mirco on one side and Fairchild and Alpex on the other. Fairchild claimed in its countersuit that Mirco knew the game they agreed on couldn't pass federal regulations, while Mirco accused Fairchild of deliberately withholding ICs to keep it out of the home market. The two sides settled in January 1979. Alpex would see one major change by going with Fairchild. By 1975, Fairchild had spent 2 years developing its own microprocessor, the F8, which would replace the Intel 8080 found in Raven. According to engineer Nicholas Talesfore on the Channel F Files podcast, the company was interested in showing off its own equipment and would eventually buy the parts used in the Channel F from its subsidiary Exatron. The F8 would prove to be an important piece of the Channel F story, as interviews I've had with former Fairchild staffers Rich Olney, Rich Page, and Bob Hartman indicate. The F8 was the proverbial brainchild of engineer David Chung, who brought in Olney and Suresh Vasa as the design engineers for it.
The design goal of the F8 was to form a complete system with only two chips, the 3850 processor chip and the 3851 program storage chip. The F8 was designed for high-volume applications that needed a low-cost solution. That design goal made the F8 a good choice for a cartridge-based game system. You could conceive of a game that had just the F8 CPU with video memory in the console and had the F8 PSU chip in the cartridge. Rich Olney.
Replacing the Intel 8080 with the F8 also made sense from a functionality perspective. According to Fairchild documentation for retailers, the F8 was faster and used fewer bytes than the 8080, both important considerations for a game system where memory space would be at a premium. Olney said that work had gotten underway on the F8 in 1973, with both the 8080 and the Motorola 6800 serving as benchmarks. Given that time frame, he said the design itself was handled using large, clear vinyl sheets, with each layer of the chip being drawn out by hand. Hartman managed the integrated circuit design for the microprocessor. TTL logic circuits were used to test the prototype chip designs using hardware emulation. Olney explained that initially, to write test software, the team had to use timeshare computer systems to create an assembler and simulation programs. One of Page's jobs on the project, along with eventually becoming a design engineer himself. But once Fairchild was able to produce physical chips, the team built a development board known as the F8M. The F8M essentially is designed to be able to halt the computer or single-step it, or to examine or alter memory. Olney explained that none of these were functions built into the F8 itself due to its design split between the CPU and program chips. But the F8M used that design to its advantage with specially designed logic to halt the F8's operation. The F8M was also the origin of Fairchild's first internally produced game for the F8, a version of Blackjack written by Suresh Vasa, which would later be converted by a contractor named Jerry Thacker to the Channel F, with some graphical flair added by Olney. Blackjack was little more than a test program, but it was a test program that you could play and have fun with. The F8M would later be supplanted by the F8S, which used the newly developed 3853 memory chip to replace a TTL equivalent used in the older unit. The F8M and the F8S would become the basis of the F8 Formulator, a desktop computer system based on the F8 that would be the new development platform for Raven, now known under the codename Stratos at Fairchild. Fairchild was buffeted by the events of the mid-70s by this point, with mass layoffs taking place between 1973 and 1975 due to the oil crisis in the Middle East, and the F8 team was no exception. Olney remembered the survivors of the fall 1975 layoffs were roped into a new microsystems division to support the F8 as a system. Head of F8 development David Chung was not among them, while Olney himself would be recruited by Lawson for his new video games group to help with turning Stratos into a commercial product. Lawson headed up electronic engineering and software development for Stratos, helping design the circuit board that the commercial game console would use and ensuring that the graphics were upgraded to color. Nicholas Talesfore handled industrial design for the case, controllers, and cartridges. Talesfore told the Channel F Files podcast that he had worked with Landrum at National Semiconductor and was working as an independent consultant initially, being hired in with Fairchild after mentioning he was about to take a job with competitor Atari. To deal with actually designing the cartridge mechanism, Tales 4 brought in Ron Smith to head mechanical engineering based on his experience with the Novus 7100, a prototype pocket calculator with a removable memory module. According to a Fast Company article by Ben Jedwards, Tales 4 had the idea of basing the game cartridge design off of an 8-track tape due to its sturdiness, and he himself was responsible for everything you could see in the packaging. Tales 4 hired commercial artist Tom Kamifuji to do the label designs for the video carts, resulting in the flashy and distinctive style seen on at least the first clutch of releases. Meanwhile, Ron Smith designed the mechanism used to insert and remove the cartridge in such a way that would protect the sensitive contacts, with a cartridge cover that would shift aside as it was inserted, and a locking mechanism to make sure it wouldn't be accidentally removed. This inadvertently also gave Atari a leg up on their VCS cartridge design, as the contract engineer Smith hired to assist him in the design, Doug Hardy, quit before it was done and started work at Atari, where he developed their own cartridge shells and mechanisms. Lawson, Tales 4, and Smith also worked to transform the complex Raven control scheme into a singular controller, coming up with a design that players could hold in one hand while manipulating a knob on top. The knob could be moved in 8 directions like a standard joystick, but also could be twisted 45 degrees clockwise or counterclockwise, and pulled up and pushed down. In effect, this knob had the same degree of functionality as an NES controller years in advance. The controllers themselves could be stored in the console, which had a storage bay on top covered by smoked plexiglass. Tales 4 said the controllers were originally intended to be removable, but the production cost of the hardware led to those connectors being cut and the controllers hardwired.
We finished a whole engineering task in a record time. Me and my guys ended up putting it in production in 6 months. Our management never understood that that was a record time. And we were considered mavericks because we didn't follow the rules of the game. But if we look back for parallel functions, we'll find that many other developments were maverick. You had to be a maverick to get things done because traditionally there were people there ready to stick their foot out to say that's not the way it's done this way.
Meanwhile, Lawson brought in a team of developers to begin making games for Stratos, using F8 formulators to program and create these new titles. Haskell worked on converting his programs from the Raven prototype alongside Fairchild engineer Vilas Munshi, who told me that he had started work at Fairchild in the test design section of the company, moving to games because he was excited at the possibility of a programmable game system. Munshi would go on to develop other early games, such as Desert Fox and the Math Quiz titles, before working for a time on a cart containing 7 or 8 distinct games on it before he was laid off in 1978. Olney worked on converting the F8M Blackjack game for the new system, while Lawson himself wrote a game called Space War that had a passing resemblance to the 1962 computer game. Interestingly, the hockey and tennis games that Haskell and Munshi put together were built into the Channel F itself. If no cartridges in the slot, the system would boot to those games instead. The other initial member of the development team was a fellow named Michael Glass, though Fairchild would quickly begin staffing up. These folks and the later developers, including Brad Fuller, Rick Moore, and Don Ruffcorn, produced a series of games for the Channel F, working in a space Moore described in a 2004 Classic Gaming Expo panel as a small room with a few attached offices. This was a fairly lean software development team, though certainly a talented one. Moore described Ruffcorn as being someone who could whip up a prototype in under a week and start making a game from there, and he was responsible for the bowling and baseball games in the Channel F, as well as the sound effects for Sonar Search, a battleship clone. Some correspondence between Olney and Ruffcorn, shared with me by the former, revealed the latter's development philosophy for the Channel F.
My programming cleverness was designing games to taunt Lawson and engage players, such as the baseball curveball feature, which on first play, Jerry swung, missed, and let out a roar.
Glass was described as an eccentric but brilliant developer who unfortunately passed away in 2005. According to Lawson and Moore at that same CGE 2004 panel, Glass found a way to access a few additional bytes of memory that were normally being used by the F8, and given that the Stratos design only had 64 bytes of RAM, this was no minor achievement. Glass had previously developed an arcade game called Spitfire for Innovative Coin through the contractor Wizard Kings, and after Wizard Kings went under, he took a new job at Fairchild, where Glass decided to simply reuse his game concept. With Spitfire on the Channel F, Glass assembled the first console game with a true AI opponent that got more or less aggressive based on how well the player was doing. and even attempting to slip his name into the program as an Easter egg, though a minor cartridge hardware change ended up breaking his secret screen until it was rediscovered on an emulator decades later. Maurer himself would eventually be the author of the acclaimed Space Invaders port for the Atari VCS, but here in his early days he produced a Breakout clone, a football game, and a version of Hangman, all of which are fairly solid renditions of their source material. Game ideas were also coming through from other staff at Fairchild, no matter how implausible they may have been on the Channel F hardware. A staffer named Mike Hatcher submitted several game ideas in April 1976 to Lawson, coming up with the concept for Moonshi's math quiz titles Torpedo Alley, which would be coupled with another game, Robot War, and Flying Saucer, which bears some resemblance to Lawson's Space War. Hatcher also came up with 2 more games that Lawson felt would not be possible in the Channel F hardware due to memory constraints. Slalom, a 2-player skiing game, and Race to the Moon, which was essentially Atari's space race turned on its side. During an Alpex v Nintendo lawsuit, Lawson was brought in as an expert witness and explained that some of their game ideas came from popular arcade releases, while others were their own concepts. The January 1978 edition of internal Fairchild newsletter Pacific Circuit, held at the Strong Museum of Play along with other internal documents saved by Lawson, also describes a create a game competition for employees, with the winner, Robert Boston, coming up with the idea for a game called Wizards, where the titular characters try to drive a boulder past the other player's goal. Developer Brad Reed South would write this game under the name Boulder Ball, later released as Video Whizball, and much like Glass before him, he would sneak his name into the code as an Easter egg. Reed South noted in an email to homebrew author and collector Frederick Blowholtz in 2001 that the game had to be radically changed to fit the screen resolution of the Channel F, and that when he snuck his name into the game, he was unaware that Michael Glass was doing the same with Spitfire and the Channel F demo cart. Once the industrial design was complete and software was underway, it was time to get the Stratos, initially introduced as the video entertainment system before, Tales Foresaid, being renamed the Channel F by a marketing staffer for a Sears deal that fell through, to stores in time for the Christmas season of 1976. According to Lawson, during his keynote at the Classic Gaming Expo in 2005, the console was a big hit at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show, with enough of a crowd that he had trouble even getting to the bathroom. But to make it to retailers, Fairchild had to go through the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. The FCC regulates broadcast frequencies in the United States, and home game systems fell under their purview due to their basic design. Here you not only had computer chips emitting small amounts of electromagnetic signals, but you also needed a radio frequency, or RF, modulator to actually connect them to the television. At the time, if you wanted to connect a game system to a television, you had to use the connectors designed for antennas to pick up signals. A wire would come out of the game system, which you would then plug into a switch box, and that would in turn be connected to the terminal on your television that the antenna would normally plug into. If you still wanted to watch TV, you'd connect the antenna to the other side of the switch box. When you wanted to play a game, the RF modulator in the console would emit effectively a low-power television signal that would be channeled directly into the TV through the cable and switch box. This arrangement also meant the systems could emit interference that could affect other TVs and radios. And since this was very new technology, the FCC set very stringent requirements that frequently tripped up game makers in the 1970s. Fairchild was no different.
It was much more of a challenge than any of us on the design team expected. We noticed lines on the Sharp television set while developing the game, but Jerry wasn't concerned since the game looked great on the Sony TV. Our small design team had not designed a consumer product before and didn't have any experience with meeting the FCC requirements. Richard Olney.
According to memos provided by Olney, the Channel F was submitted to the FCC for approval on July 6th to hit a late September distribution timetable, but about a month later the company received word that it had been rejected. Olney and another engineer, Will Alexander, were put on the job of figuring out how to reduce RF radiation from the system to get FCC certification. The design had several stumbling blocks, he said. While Alexander's RF modulator design was solid, and the hardware was clocked slow enough to limit emissions, some of the TTL logic on the board had a tendency to spike emissions. The circuit board was also only double-sided, meaning it didn't have as many ground planes as a multi-layer board would. The controllers had 8-foot cables at the time, which the FCC found could be stretched out as makeshift antennas. Since Fairchild didn't have an isolation test lab, Olney said they did testing in the middle of the night when other equipment in the building was turned off and FM radio stations had stopped broadcasting for the day. The two men set about trying to pinpoint and redesign the problem areas on the board with assistance from Lawson. It was Lawson who realized that they could reduce emissions by cutting the controller cord length down to 4 feet, though this only partially solved the issue. By September, the RF emissions were still too high, and Fairchild management brought in consultants to resolve the issue quickly. Their solution was to encase the entire game system in additional shielding, which did cut down emissions dramatically, but also increased the production cost and complexity of the hardware. According to the October 21st New York Times, the Channel F passed FCC certification at that time and entered production shortly thereafter.
And finally, after 3 days, one of the chief engineers there came out of the lobby, kind of waved to me and said, "Here's your number, go home." I said, "We passed, right?" But the big interesting thing about the industry was that many people were sitting in the lobby trying to figure out who Fairchild guy was. And I ran out like, I guess, a sister in Boys Town. I was really feeling good. And ran out the door, and then ran back in the door, and I said, "I'm the Fairchild guy," and we passed.
The system started reaching store shelves after Thanksgiving alongside Video Cart 1, with Video Cart 2 and 3 following in December. That said, supplies were severely limited due in part to the FCC delay. A Business Week interview with Corrigan from August 1977 reports that the company only sold 15,000 units, though Electronic News reported that January that the company had sold between 50 and 60,000 Channel Fs, so it's possible the Business Week reporter misheard Corrigan. In either event, this was as many units as the company could produce in time for the season. It's also possible that, in addition to time constraints, the industry-wide parts shortage also played a role. To put this in perspective, Landrum's initial market report projected Fairchild producing and selling 200,000 Channel F units in 1976, and there's no reason to suspect that Fairchild would not have at least tried to reach that number. Weekly Television Digest even had the optimistic view that the company would sell 2 million units in 1976. And indeed, the Channel F appears to have been in demand, and had all the makings of a more successful product if not for issues Fairchild was having elsewhere. The previously mentioned August 1977 Business Week article about the company calls its video game division, quote, "the one horse left to ride," after the collapse of the digital watch market walloped a massive chunk of Fairchild's finances. Fairchild reportedly lost $8 million in the second quarter of 1977, almost entirely due to the digital watch market imploding, and ended up laying off a third of its consumer products workforce. While the video game segment of the company was only marginally profitable, according to Corrigan, they hoped to increase those margins with a redesign to the system that would reduce the IC chip count from 40 to about 7. Both Tales4 and Lawson indicated in interviews that Fairchild's policy of buying its own chips from its Exitron division proved problematic, as they were stuck with whatever prices Exitron was setting and couldn't shop around like Atari was. Finally, Corrigan told Weekly Television Digest in mid-77 that distribution was to remain limited while the company firmed up dealer relationships, further digging how much the company could make off the system. To help improve profitability, Fairchild opted to sell new cartridges year-round. This was a dramatic shift from the highly seasonal nature of the home video game industry at the time. Stores would order games for the fall, and whatever was left over after Christmas would be discounted until the next holiday season rolled around. This remained the case with dedicated systems, but with software cartridges, new games could come out at other points in the year and not take up much shelf space. Spitfire and Space Force started reaching shelves in the spring of 1977, followed by the math quiz games in the summer, and baseball, drag strip, maze, magic numbers, and backgammon following that fall. It didn't take long for Fairchild's competitors in the programmable space to follow suit, and notably, Atari stuck it out with this seasonal release trend for its VCS in 1977 and 78, before deciding to follow Fairchild's lead. 1977 was the year that the company's management made a decision that likely put the nail in the coffin for the Channel F as a market leader, however. While Fairchild was still aiming to sell 250,000 units of 1977, Corrigan said in that Business Week feature that the digital watch fiasco was causing the company to scale back production of Channel F consoles, allowing competitor Atari to fill in the order gaps from dealers and sell through its entire stock of approximately 340,000 programmable VCS units. Atari became the market leader in 1977 and would retain that position for years. Additionally, the extra components and RF shielding in the Channel F meant its average price point of $170 was higher than the VCS. To improve the profitability, the system would need to be redesigned. Olney said engineer Al Lechner started work on redesigning the Channel F hardware to reduce the number of components on the board, while simultaneously dealing with the RF emissions issues of the original design. Fairchild appears to have submitted a revised version of the system that would cost less to the FCC in May 1977, in an attempt to bring their system's cost down to match RCA Studio 2, at $150. This effort led to what Olney dubbed the Channel F 1.5, a hybrid of both the original and redesign that features two custom chips replacing the TTL but still has the built-in speaker and RF circuit design from the original board. Channel F units produced at least as of September 1977 appear to use this newer internal design. This cost reduction effort ultimately resulted in the Channel F2, a redesign that started reaching stores in 1978. Fairchild also started an ad campaign for the holiday season featuring comedian Milton Berle to push the redesign, which was smaller, had removable controllers, and replaced the in-console speaker with the ability to run audio through the RF signal like the Atari VCS did. Tales 4 was responsible for the case design of this unit and said it was inspired by the recent hit movie Star Wars. For the company's side of things, this did indeed result in a machine that was cheaper to produce and did not suffer from the RF spikes the earlier design did. Fairchild continued looking into new markets for the Channel F and found partners in Europe to market the machine, such as the West German company Saba. At CGE 2004, Lawson explained that Fairchild would sell Saba the parts, with Saba building the equipment and marketing it there. He remembered hearing that some games weren't selling well there and that Saba wanted a chess game, which they believed would be a boon to selling consoles. Lawson went into more detail at a keynote at the Vintage Computer Festival in 2006, describing that Saba contracted with Fairchild to come up with a chess cart, known internally as Super Chess, based on documents it held at the Strong Museum, which included an LED that lit up when the computer was thinking and some onboard memory. Lawson recalled the plan was to package the chess game with the Saba Channel F clone and market the console as a video chess platform, though he has no insight into how well that effort went. Nevertheless, Schach is the sole Channel F release that never showed up anywhere else but West Germany. Not long after the Channel F2 design was finalized, work got underway on what was known as TV POW. According to research by Kat DeSpira, TV POW was a concept for people to play video games remotely by yelling POW into a phone line, which would cause the system to do something at a television studio. The primary proponent and the real person behind its existence was Florida game show host Marvin Kempner, who championed it after being pitched the concept by a pair of radio DJs. The original proposal would have used Magnavox's Odyssey, but after that deal fell through, Kempner came to an agreement with Fairchild. Such a system would be used with the Channel F to fire a shot in the shooting gallery game. The idea would be to show the game running on television with the player calling in. Olney worked on this project up through April 1978 when he left the company. He said his work largely focused on putting together an acoustic system that would capture the sound coming out of the phone and trigger the game system to fire a shot. The word POW was chosen over the original idea of bang because the P sound was easier to detect on the hardware. A field test in Denver had mixed results. While the telephone system worked, the Channel F system itself would not sync to the master video signal at the TV station. Fairchild's engineers evidently continued working on this project after Olney's departure, as TV POW did debut after a fashion in October 1978. While the TV signal issue was eventually resolved, the acoustic system had a delay of up to 4 seconds before it would activate, rendering the game essentially unplayable. The hacked-together solution was to simply have someone physically operating the system's controller and firing shots when they heard the player yell POW into the phone line. Despite this inauspicious resolution to the problem, TV POW as a concept would be syndicated to 79 stations across North America and air for the next few years in local markets, eventually being applied to other game consoles such as the Intellivision. Another 5 games were released in the spring and summer of 1978. Robot War / Torpedo Alley, Pinball Challenge, Sonar Search, Memory Match, and Dodge It. It was at this time that Fairchild engineers also started developing a keyboard controller for the Channel F. This appears to have been similar to the ones released by Atari that year, and a handful of games were being designed to take advantage of them, called K-Carts, as seen in brochures. According to Tales 4, the keyboard seen in these ads and photos is actually just a model, as a working unit was never tooled. By October 1978, the keyboard had been delayed until January, before disappearing entirely. The games that were in development for it appeared to have been shifted over to use standard controllers or were cancelled entirely. A final tranche of Fairchild-branded carts, Bowling, Video, Whizball, and Hangman, came out alongside the Channel F2 for Christmas 1978. Weekly Television Digest reports that General Instrument, a chip supplier for Fairchild, Atari, and others, anticipated about 200,000 Channel Fs to be manufactured and sold that year, though Lawson estimated in a court deposition for Alpex v. Parker Brothers that only 50,000 units at best sold that year as Fairchild's financial troubles continued. Fairchild's annual report for 1978 indicates that the company had dramatically reduced Channel F production in response to perceived oversupply in the marketplace. This may have been bad for the Channel F's fortunes, but the concern was very real. Reports from the retail trade magazine Merchandising suggest that the market for dedicated video game systems fell out entirely in 1978, relegating those machines to the low end of the market. The programmable market itself also suffered, as retailers tried to gauge consumer interest amid the collapsing dedicated game market, while chip shortages hurt companies trying to manufacture consoles and cartridges. Atari itself was unable to sell through its stock of 800,000 VCS units that year, with only 550,000 sold. Retailers also struggled with the logistics of selling game cartridges and needing to demonstrate how the games worked, and with concerns that programmable games would be the same sort of fad product as CB radios and digital watches, they refocused attention on other types of electronic games. Fairchild's pare-down makes sense in context, but did little to shore up its market share or get the company back on secure financial footing. Finally, in 1979, Fairchild had to give up the ghost. In February, the company announced it was dropping its Time Products division due to market instability and would refocus its effort on high technology. By April, it was clear that the game-selling struggles in 1978 had hit the Channel F2, and facing the anticipated flat market in 1979, Fairchild announced it was getting out of the market. The company sold off its video game division to Zircon, and by the summer the rest of Fairchild was acquired by Schlumberger after an attempted takeover by Gould Incorporated. Whether they left then or were laid off in one of Fairchild's previous belt-tightening events, the former Channel F-related staffers went on to new pastures and challenges. Lawson started VideoSoft, a third-party game and program development company where he hired on Michael Glass as a developer. Along with his other staffers, they created VCS games for other publishers and would produce a color bar generator to use on the system in 1984. Rick Maurer and Vilas Munchi went to Atari itself, where Maurer developed VCS games and Munchi worked on Atari computer software. Olney took a position with Consolidated Video Systems to do electrical design of interface products for a video editor. Vasa went to work elsewhere in the electronics industry, designing a microprocessor for ATMs. Ruff Korn became a freelance game designer for a period in the early 80s, producing a trio of games published on the VCS by Telesys. Tales 4 would design Atari VCS cartridge shells for Activision and Data Age, to ensure they did not violate any of Atari's patents, and would end up hired by Zircon to tweak the Channel F controller design so that a button could be added to the handle. This variation would also end up being sold for Atari controller-compatible devices as well as for the Channel F2. Hartman would go to Signetics to do design work on the 2650 microprocessor family, while Page joined HP and later Apple Computers. And Dr. David Chung, the veritable father of the F8, left Fairchild to co-found Tech, which produced the F8-based computer called Video Brain. Zircon initially took to selling off leftover Channel F stock, including a few games that were completed but not published by Fairchild, specifically Checkers, Galactic Space War, Pro Football, and Slot Machine. According to Reed Self, Zircon felt that they could move Channel F hardware a little easier with some new games, and he wrote a Space Invaders clone entitled Alien Invasion on Speculation for Zircon. Reed Self described it as a copy of the Atari VCS game that didn't quite play as well as Maurer's title. It was made on a tight timetable and on a platform that was incredibly restrictive for the premise. He still managed to sneak in a couple Easter eggs, though not many people must have come across it. Reed Self said that the game sold poorly and that both he and Zircon ended up taking a bath on it. The other new Channel F game release was Casino Poker, advertised as Casino Royale, and very little information is available on its performance. Zircon appears to have stopped selling the Channel F after the 1982 Christmas season, or about the time the entire home market was starting to come apart due to overstock. While this was the commercial end of the Channel F, the system has played host to a small number of homebrew games in recent years, thanks to improving emulation. While the system and its developers were truly pioneers in the home gaming space, Circumstances really beyond their control led to the system's downfall. Would the Channel F have succeeded if Fairchild hadn't been hit by the collapsing digital watch market as badly as it had? Would the system have ruled the roost if it had passed FCC certification on the first try? It's impossible to say for sure, but none of this can take away from what the system did accomplish. It kicked off the era of programmable home game systems, pioneered interchangeable cartridge technology, provided a showcase for microprocessors in the home, produced games on par with what its competitors were selling despite working with an increasingly antiquated design, and perhaps most famously today, was a major video game project headed up by a black engineer. Fairchild and Elpex's weird little box showed the first glimpses of what was possible in this medium, and it should be celebrated for that.